Joe had always been a thrill seeker, the kind of guy who thrived on the rush of the unknown. That's probably what led him to the world of storage unit auctions, a gamble where a few $100 could either buy him a pile of trash or, on rare occasions, a treasure trove. For Joe, each bid was a heartbeat-skipping moment, the thrill of lifting a rusted lock to reveal a mystery. Some days, it was just old furniture, stacks of musty books, or forgotten clothes. But the stories of big scores, classic cars, cash, even rare antiques kept him coming back, his eyes always gleaming with hope. That morning, Joe found himself at an auction for a 5x15 storage unit. From the outside, it looked like any other Dusty, a bit weathered, nothing special. Around 20 people had gathered, a mix of seasoned bidders and curious newcomers. The auctioneer's voice droned on, and bids bounced back and forth like a well-rehearsed tennis match. Joe stayed quiet at first, watching the others carefully, gauging their eagerness. The starting bid was $100. Way too high, he thought. But something about this unit felt different, almost like a whisper in the back of his mind telling him to hold on, not to walk away. When the bidding hit $350, most people dropped out, but Joe couldn't. His hands were clammy, his heart racing. He knew it was a risk, but that's what he lived for. At $500, the final bid was his. His hands shook a little as he unlocked the unit and pulled open the door, a slow screech echoing off the metal walls. A few others hung back, curious to see what he'd just burned his cash on. Inside, old furniture was piled haphazardly, scratched tables, worn-out chairs, a faded chest of drawers. Disappointment flickered in Joe's chest. The whole lot might bring in a couple $100 if he was lucky, nowhere near what he'd just spent. But he couldn't give up yet. Picking through the clutter, he found a dull gray container wedged behind a stack of chairs. Heavy, sealed, locked tight. Now his pulse was pounding for a different reason. He borrowed a drill from a friend, working the lock with slow, careful precision. The lid creaked open, and Joe's breath caught. The first thing he saw was a bundle of VHS tapes, stacked neatly, almost deliberately, and then, under the tapes, something glinted. He pulled the tapes out, his fingers trembling slightly, and saw a thick bundle wrapped in old sticky paper. Inside were stacks of $50 bills, neatly packed, all real. He couldn't believe it, couldn't wrap his mind around what he was seeing. He was holding a fortune, maybe $1 million or more? But before he could count it, a folded note caught his eye, wedged between the tapes. In sloppy, hurried handwriting, it said just one word: "Don't." The simplicity of it sent chills down his spine, and for a moment Joe's excitement faltered. The tapes were labeled with dates, but nothing else. No names, no titles, just a series of numbers that felt more ominous the longer he stared. Joe's nerves were buzzing, part of him wanting to leave the tapes alone, the other part too consumed by curiosity. Against his better judgment, he took one, slid it into an old VCR he kept in his garage for his daughter's Disney movies, and hit play. At first, the screen just buzzed with static, and then the picture cleared. The grainy footage showed a dimly lit room, the camera angle awkward, like it had been set up hastily. As the seconds ticked by, Joe's hands began to sweat. He never said what he saw on that tape, but when the screen went black again, he ripped it out and almost threw it across the room. He was still staring at the dark screen when a knock rattled his front door. The police. They had arrived within 2 hours of his finding the money. Joe's stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. How could they know already? He hadn't told anyone but his girlfriend, snapping a few pictures in his excitement. Maybe she had said something. Or maybe the wrong people had been watching. The officers didn't waste time. They moved in, questions sharp and eyes sharper. How did he find it? What did he see? Had he watched the tapes? Joe stammered through half-truths, his mind a whirlwind of panic. The officers took the money and the tapes, logging everything carefully, but the real shock came a few hours later when Joe got a call, not from the police, but from a lawyer claiming to represent the storage unit's original owner. The man on the other end of the line was cold and professional, his words precise. He wanted the money back, all $7,500,000 of it. In return, he'd be willing to let Joe keep a finder's fee of $600,000. But the undertone was clear. This wasn't a request, it was a warning. Joe's palms were slick with sweat, the phone slippery in his hand. Who the hell leaves $7,500,000 in a storage unit and then loses track of it? His mind spun with questions, each darker than the last. And those tapes, what could be so bad that someone would leave a note just to warn people away? For the next week, Joe barely slept. Paranoia crawled into his mind, shadows stretched too long in the corners of his vision. Every time a car slowed near his house, his heart stuttered in his chest. He even thought he saw a figure watching from across the street one night, but when he looked again, there was nothing there. Desperate, Joe contacted a lawyer of his own who confirmed the worst. Legally, the contents were his, but practically, he was in over his head. The original owner's lawyers weren't backing down. Eventually, they raised the offer. $1,200,000 as a finder's fee if Joe signed a non-disclosure agreement and returned the rest. It was more money than he'd ever seen, more than he could have dreamed of. But the threats had already started. Anonymous calls, menacing notes shoved into his mailbox. In the end, he took the deal, signed the papers, handed over the money, and shut his mouth. But even with $1,200,000 in his account, Joe couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on his back, or the nightmares that dragged him awake in the dark, gasping for breath. Because the truth was, it wasn't the money that haunted him, it was the tapes, the things he'd seen, the questions without answers. And maybe, just maybe, some doors were better left unopened.